Hello again. In this lesson we're going to talk about snapshots 6, 7, and 8. And at a high level we're really working on fully implementing the functionality for our application and refining some of the functionality that we've already built. We've already got most of the major building blocks in place. We have our UI, we have the code that retrieves the XML from the internet, and then we've also got our database set up, and we've even done some binding up to this point. Now what we want to do is more fully implement all of these and tie them together. So I'm going to run snapshot number 6 just to show you what we've been able to accomplish in this snapshot. Our focus in this snapshot was making this whole relationship between the folder combo box, the channel list box, and the news item list box, as well as binding the more detail-oriented controls over here on the right-hand side, all working together correctly. So, for example, if I select blog feeds from the folder combo box, it'll only show me those channels that are associated with that particular folder. If I were to change this to tech news, you can see the channels change, and whenever I select a given channel, it'll display only those news items that are associated with that given channel. When I select a news item, you can see the associated properties for that given news item then are displayed, including our web page in our little web browser control, which is pretty cool. Okay, so how is this accomplished? Well, let's take a look at some of the code that makes this all work. Now, what we didn't show you in the previous snapshot was that whenever we bound these controls, it automatically created some code in the main form load event, and I've revised some of that, but this code is fairly simple. It takes each of the table adapters, in this case for the news item, in this case for the folder, we also had one for the channels, which I've removed, and it fills the appropriate data table in the data set with data from the database. So remember what the purpose of the news item table adapter was, or rather just a table adapter from lessons 8 and 9. Again, it's kind of the go-between between your database and your data set. Your database being your long-term persistent storage mechanism, the file on your hard drive, the data set being the in-memory version of that data. So when changes are made to the data set, they'll be propagated eventually back into the underlying database through the use of this same table adapter. We'll see that in the next snapshot or two. Now, the reason you don't see the channel table adapter is because I removed that and put it into its own helper method. So if you look in lines 165 through 172, we have the private void refresh channels, which is a private helper method that I created in order to make sure that we're not constantly calling this code. So first of all, I check to see if our channel data table contains any values, any rows. If it does not, then I want to fill it up. So I call the channel table adapter fill, passing in the data set, and specifically we're asking it to fill up the channel data table with some data from the database. Once that task is complete, then we'll want to only display those channels that are associated with the current folder. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, we need to make sure that something has been selected in the folder combo box. If nothing's been selected, then we can simply ignore this refresh channels method. However, I suspect that this line of code will always fire, but I'm just making sure that nothing bad can happen. So I do a check. If it's not empty, if it's not null, then we want to filter out all of the channel binding source records. So what is the channel binding source? Do you recall from lesson 9 specifically? The binding source's job is to make sure that the values that are in the data set, especially like the current record there's a pointer to in that data table of that data set, is accurately reflected in the UI. It's kind of that go-between piece, okay? Well, it has a filter method, so we can filter out those records in our data table that meet some criteria. In this case, the criteria which we're setting is to see if only those channels where the folder ID is equal to whatever the selected folder combo box selection is. Okay? So we're going to filter out and look at only those channels where the folder ID, the foreign key, is equal to whatever has been selected in our folder combo box. Make sense? Okay, so let's move on. So we're calling that from the main form. I suspect we'll be calling it from other places in our form as well at various times. Now I did something very similar to that for the news items. So you can see I created another helper method called private void refresh news items. I want the exact same thing to happen. First of all, notice that I have this whole first structure where I'm only filling up the news item data table if there's no rows in the news item data table currently. Okay, so that's that lines 179 and 180 rather. In lines 182 and 183, I'm doing the exact same thing where I'm only displaying those news items where the channel ID, the foreign key, is equal to the current selection in the channels list box. So, just again to make this clear, I only want to display the news items in that list box that correspond with the selection made in this list box. Okay. So I have these two helper methods to refresh channels and refresh news items. Just came up with the name off the top of my head. Didn't really follow any standard other than just to kind of use a similar naming convention because they kind of accomplish the same things just on different objects, channels versus news items. Okay. Now, so when somebody makes a selection in a combo box, whenever the selected index of that folder combo box is changed, so let me just relate this to what's going on the form. When somebody makes a selection in the folder, we need to kick off some things. So we're going to kick off the refresh news channels, and once we have the selected channels for the given folder displayed, then we'll refresh the news items because undoubtedly at least one channel will be present, and if one is present, one will be selected, and we'll want to display the news items for the selected channel. Okay? Same thing is true if somebody clicks on the channel list box. That's going to fire off the channel list box selected in exchange. Now in this case, we're only going to fire off the refresh news items. There's no need to call the refresh channels because nothing changed in the folder box. The folder is exactly the same. Now we do something fairly similar here in the news items list box where somebody selects a news item. We need to make sure that the correct record is displayed here. So how do we accomplish that? Well, let's take a look at our code again. So we have to make sure that the selected index is something, that it's not -1. If it is something, if there is an actual selection in the news item list box, then what we're going to do is work with that news item binding source. Remember, we talked about binding source about just a moment ago. What was the purpose of the binding source? Again, to make sure that the data that's being displayed on the form is the data that is being pointed to by ADO.NET behind the scenes, the specific record that is the current record. Okay, so we set the position of that news item binding source equal to the current selected index from our news item list box. So when we select a news item, it fires off this event, which then sets the binding source position to the currently selected item. So then how do all these display data? Well, I simply went to the properties of each of these controls, at the very bottom to the data section, select data bindings, and set the text property by finding the binding source that I wanted to work with, the news item binding source, and then selecting the title for the title text box, the description for the description text box, and so on. Okay, hopefully that all makes sense. Okay, so things are going along swimmingly right now. We are able to display things on screen in a very organized way. It took quite a bit of code to accomplish that, but the results are looking fairly good at the moment, so we need to move on. Okay, so after another hour, hour and a half of work, we're looking at snapshot number 7. And the real purpose of snapshot number 7 was to hook up the two biggest pieces of the puzzle. The data that we're pulling down from the internet, how are we going to get that into the database? So that's really what we wanted to tackle this time. And the answer to that question wasn't completely obvious to me at first. I had to do some soul searching about how I wanted to approach this. One of the biggest challenges that I had was making sure that the code that I wrote for the RSS manager would not be permanently bound to this application, that I could remove it from this application and use it elsewhere. In object-oriented terms, this is called low coupling. I don't want to couple my implementation of the RSS manager with this application, because if I do, then if I wanted to use this in another application, it would be very difficult to rip it apart, and essentially I'd have to start all over again. So what does that mean? Why did I have that fear? Well, up to this point in the RSS manager, we had not implemented the data, how we were going to save data into the database, and this really posed quite a dilemma for me. Would I store the data in the database directly from my refresh RSS, which, by the way, I have renamed. It's now called Process Newsfeed. And there's a lot of that goes on. You're going to find better names for things as you continue to program. You think, refresh RSS doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Maybe I should name it something better. But that's an aside. Okay. So I didn't want to include the functionality of saving data into the database from this method, even though I had it in my comments at the very bottom. And the reason I didn't want to do that is because it would tie me to this implementation of the process newsfeed. I could never use a different database. I'd have to use this RSS MDF database, for example. What if I didn't want to save the newsfeed in a database? In the future, what if I wanted to, just display it and then forget about it? I couldn't. I'd have to rip all that out, and I wouldn't really be setting myself up for much code reuse. So there were several issues that really made me rethink the way I was doing some things. So the solution I came up with was that I wanted to use this process newsfeed method to simply retrieve all of the latest RSS news items from the internet, and then let some other code take on the chore of saving that data into the database for my application. So I needed to figure out a way of how was I going to package all this data up and communicate it back out. So the solution I came up with, is that I created a new class in my same RSS manager file. So if this wasn't clear to you in the previous videos, I want to make sure you understand that one physical file, this rssmanager.cs file, or any .cs file, can contain multiple classes. So I have a class called newsItem now that I just created in this snapshot, as well as the class RSS manager, which I have defined below it in the exact same file. Okay? And so this newsItem class is simply just a structure. All it is going to contain a title, a link, and a description, the three pieces that make up each individual news item. And so as we grab data down from the internet, the RSS feeds from the internet, we're going to look through each individual item. Instead of displaying them in a message box like we have been doing up to this point, what we're going to do is put them into one of these news item objects, and then add them to an array list. Now, an array list is like an array. It can be a collection of anything. In this case, I want it to be a collection of the individual news item objects. So if we find 5 news items through the various channels that we have subscribed to, we're going to create an array list that contains 5 individual news item. So once we pass that array list back from this method, the code that originally called our process newsfeed can then loop through each of the individual news item objects in that array list, and it can then assume the task of saving that data in the database. So that really simplified things, at least in my own mind. Now, that may not be very obvious to you, so I apologize. I'd encourage you to, at this point, download the snapshot and make sure that you understand this concept. So I've changed the method signature for the process news feed, which was formerly called refresh RSS, so that it returns back an array list, and I've used the fully qualified namespace for this, system.collections.ArrayList. It still accepts the RSS URL. So in this particular case, what we've done is create what I'm calling a return array list. The return array list will be what we return at the very bottom after we've gone through and parsed out all of the individual news items that will be passed back to the code that called our method. So you can see that in line 132. So now, as you can see, I've commented out these temporary little title, link, and description placeholders. I won't need those anymore. Instead, when I go through this process of parsing through the XML, I'm going to create a new instance of the news item object that I just created a moment ago and I showed you in the snapshot at the very top of the same file. And then for each of this, which I call temp news item, and then basically I populate temp news item.title, I populate temp news item.link, and I populate temp news item.description with the values that I'm pulling down from that XML file, the rss.xml. And then I use the add method of the return array list, passing in the newly populated temp news item object. Once I've added 1, 5, 10, 100 temp news items, I return that entire collection of news items back to the code that called it. So let's take a look at that code right now. So let's get there quickly by just clicking this. And I put the functionality in its own helper method, query channels, because there's a little extra work I had to do here, and I didn't want to put all of that right here in my event handler. So we're going to go to definition. We find it just later on the file. Maybe I should put this in its own class at some point in the future, possibly so. But as you can see, what I've done here is I start to loop through each channel. Why am I looping through the channels? Well, I have to know what's the URL for the channel so that I can call my new process newsfeed method, which I do right here. Okay. So you can see for each channel, it's going to pass in the URL. So that gives us, we've gotten rid of that hard-coded msdn.microsoft.com/rss.xml, gotten rid of it, and instead we've replaced it from whatever comes from the database and is currently stored in the channel data table in our data set. Okay? And what gets returned back to us, do you remember what process newsfeed returns? It returns an array list that's fully populated with a bunch of news items. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to roll through each news item that is currently collected in the array list that we retrieve from our process newsfeed. And so as we look at each individual news item, we're going to do some checks on it. First of all, we're going to make sure the length is not too long. We're going to replace any of these single quote marks with nothing, because sometimes whenever we have quote marks in a literal string, it messes up our insert into the database. We can probably fix that in the future, but I just chose to take the easy way, and I've got a long comment about it here in code if you take a look at lines 242 through 252. Okay. And then what I'm trying to do is create a filter expression. Now let me explain what I'm trying to accomplish here. I already have all the news items in my data set that I retrieved whenever I started up the application. Okay, that's what that refresh news item helper method did. So we have a fully populated news item data table, and so now I have this new list of news items that I just collected from the internet. Some of those are going to overlap. We don't want to save any of the old ones into the database. We only want to save ones that we don't already have. So in order to accomplish that, and there could have been a number of different approaches I took for this, I just wanted to make it as as straightforward as possible. Maybe I didn't accomplish that, I don't know. But in order to accomplish that, take a look at line 263. What I did was I took this filter expression, so only give me where those news items where the title equals the current title for the current news item that we're looping through. And we're going to use this select method of our news item data table to find if we already have that news item saved in our database. If we do, we don't want to save it. So that's what this line of code does in 265. If the filter news items.length, so if the length of the array that's returned back from this whole selection process, which returns an array of data rows into something called filtered news items, if that length equals 0, then we need to add it to the database as you see here. Otherwise, we'll ignore it and continue on and look at the next item. Okay, so hopefully that made sense. We're just making sure that the item's not already in the database. If it's not, then we're going to create a new row in our data set and then save that row into our data set. So that's what we've done in lines 269 through 276. Created a new instance of a news item row, and we begin to set the title, the description, the link, the channel ID, the date acquired. And then we take that new row object and call the add news item row method of our news item data table. Okay, at this point, we have not saved anything back to the database at all. Things are just temporarily stored in the data set. In order to save them back to the database, we're going to have to call, as you can see in line 282, news item table adapter dot update. This update method is the magic key to take all those changes that we made to our data set. We could have made one change or 1,000 changes, but all those changes at that point in time get propagated back into the database. So any new records get saved into the database, any edited records, any deleted records, all those actions happen at the point when we call update. All right, so that was pretty complicated. There was a lot to do. It took quite a bit of time to implement all of that. But now the result of this is that hopefully everything gets saved into the database when we run our application. So let's go ahead and run our app. We may get an error or two, but let's just power through it here and see what we have working so far. And you can see I've already run this a couple of times, so I've already got some items in here. When I click this, whether we saw it or not, there were new items added to the very bottom of our list. Okay, and we could check that out ourselves. You could just delete all the data out using the Database Explorer and so on. Okay, so that pretty much concludes snapshot number 7. We're going to move on now and implement the channel and folder dialogues in snapshot number 8. Okay, so we're looking at snapshot number 8. This represented quite a bit of work. What we wanted to do was fully implement the channel and folder dialogue so they work correctly. So let's go ahead and run the application just to show you how it all kind of comes together at this point. Notice now that I can create a new folder. I'm going to call this News. Click the OK button. I'm going to select News and then click Add Channel. Here I'm going to put MSN Top News, and I'm going to paste in a link and click the OK button. And as soon as I add a channel, it's going to go out and do a refresh, grab down the RSS for all the channels. So you can see now that I have my editing working. I'm going to edit, my adding working. Let's edit news. We'll call this top news or something like that. Notice that it changed in the folder. We're going to change and edit the channel, MSN top news, and I might just put something like good, like this is one of my favorites or something along those lines. And notice that it changed that as well. And I can also delete a channel, and when I do, I get this little dialog that says, are you sure you want to delete the channel? Doing so will also delete the news items for that channel. I'm going to select yes, so that deletes it. I can also delete the folder. And it says, are you sure you want to delete the current folder? Doing so will delete all the channels and messages contained in that folder. I'm going to click yes. Okay. So then we're back here to our two folders. So you can see that we've enabled quite a bit of functionality in this particular snapshot. Let's see how we did it. First of all, I took two different approaches for the folder and the channel. Let's start with the folder because it's actually easier of the two approaches. Notice that I created helper methods for each of the adding, editing, and deleting functions for folders and channels. The reason I did this is because instead of just implementing all of the code behind here for this specific button, I may have some menu items in the future that I want to include that do the exact same thing. Or I may have keyboard shortcuts that accomplish this, and I don't want to just copy and paste this exact same code and put it in another spot. I'd rather create a helper method and then point to that helper method from each place in code where I need to call. So that's just a little bit of a best practice. You should never write the same code twice or have it copied and pasted in multiple places. Okay. So here, let's go to the add folder. I'm going to select, right-click it and select go to definition. So it's just further down in the same file. Might even want to separate it out into its own class at some point. Maybe not. I chose not to in this particular case because it does have a lot to do with displaying the UI. So I may want to keep it in the same physical file. Okay, so up to this point, we really haven't talked about the strategy that we're using for our dialogues. And the strategy is this. We're going to key off of the folder ID. If the folder ID is 0, then we're telling the dialog that we want to create a new folder or new channel when we're working with the channel dialog. If the folder ID is greater than 0, then we're going to be editing an existing folder or channel, as the case might be. So before we can continue much farther, I have to show a little bit about how the folder dialog has been changed. Visually, it looks just about the same. Under the hood, in the code, it's actually dramatically different now. I've added a number of, actually 2, public properties, and then I've also added 2 private fields. A form is just like any other class, and so all I've done was added 2 extra properties to this form. And the reason I did that is because I need some way to communicate the values back and forth between the main form.cs and the folder dialog.cs. And there's a number of different strategies I could have taken to do this. I chose to do it this way. You may find a different way that you prefer. That's fine. So obviously the 2 pieces of information that I'm displaying and then also changing from the folder dialog is the folder ID and the folder name. Each of these properties have their underlying private fields as well, defined in lines 14 and 15. Okay, so let's look at the load method for our folder dialog. We've already set the dialog results on the buttons themselves, but I did it here in code as well. I think I was having a problem getting it to work, and so I was trying different things, and I might be able to remove that in the future. But again, as the form is loading, I want to set the folder ID text box and the folder name text box, these 2 text boxes, to the values that are currently being stored in my private fields. So you might be saying, well, how do those get populated? Well, let's take a look back at our main form.cs. Whenever I create a new instance of my folder dialog, you can see here that one of the first things that I do is I set the property, the folder ID property, equal to 0. Now I could have just as easily done this as well. And set folder name equal to an empty string. Since we're adding a new folder, we don't want there to be anything in the folder name text box. So immediately after we create a new instance of the folder dialog, we're going to set those two properties we created in order to pass in values. Now, it's not so crucial for adding a folder, but whenever we're editing a folder, we'll want to pass in the folder ID and the folder name so that they're accurately reflected as it's displayed to the user. Okay? Now, the rest of this code should look fairly similar. We're getting a dialog result based on whether the user clicked OK or cancel. If they clicked OK, now we have a more fully implemented version of this method. You can see here that we're creating a new folder row for our folder data table. We're going to populate the folder name into that folder row by grabbing its value from its public property on our reference to our folder dialog. Okay, so that's what we're going to say, hey, tell me, folder dialog, what did the user type in for the folder name? And because there's a public method, we're able to yank it out and use it here before we lose a reference to it here in line 265. Okay, so we've set one of the columns for our folder data table row, and here we're going to use the add folder row method, passing in our new folder row, and then we call the update method to actually make that stick into the underlying database. Okay, so the same thing is true then for the edit folder. Same thought process. Create a new instance of the folder dialog. This time we're going to get the current folder ID that's selected in the folder combo box. Okay, so that's what this line of code 273 does. And we're going to find that row in our folder data table by using this find by folder ID, passing in the folder ID. Now, how did it know to create a method called find by folder ID? One of the side benefits of creating a primary key within our database is that whenever we create a data set from it, that data set creation process will create a number of helper methods that will help us search and find specific rows or specific pieces of information based on the primary key. So it's just something that happens behind the scenes that Visual C# 2005 Express Edition takes care of for us. Like whenever it creates this RSS data set definition, if we were to double click it and look at it, it shows us a couple of these things here. The methods of the table adapter doesn't show us everything, but behind the scenes it has done a lot more work creating more helper methods for us than what it displays here. Okay, and that's one of the products of that work. So by passing in the folder ID, we're going to get the one row in our folder data table for the corresponding one that was selected by the user. Now here's where we populate the folder ID and folder name properties of our folder dialog reference, and then this should look pretty familiar. This should look pretty familiar. Here in line 284 through 286, we're going to tell that folder row that we're going to edit it. We're going to give it a new name based on what we pull from our folder dialog. Okay, and then we're going to say we're done editing, and then we're going to call that update method, and it's going to stick it in the database. Okay. Okay, so that's how the folder dialog works. I already said that the channel dialog works a little bit differently. Let's start by looking at the channel dialog. Notice that unlike the folder dialog, which doesn't have anything in the designer tray, the first clue that something is different is that we see a bunch of data set, channel adapter, folder table adapter, and two binding sources. So what gives? Well, in this implementation, I left the responsibility of saving the data to the main form.cs. But in this case, I've delegated that responsibility to the channel properties form itself. And why did I do it differently? Just to show you two different implementations. You can choose either one of these implementations if you want to do this in the future, or figure out a different way to do it. There's lots of ways to accomplish the exact same thing. Okay, so in a nutshell, let's get back here and take a look at some of the code very briefly, since we're getting rather lengthy on this particular video. Notice I've taken the same general approach where I've created two private fields and then two public methods to retrieve the channel ID and the folder ID. The channel ID is going to be the primary key, and the folder ID is the foreign key for the relationship between the current folder selected and the channel. So we can populate the list of folders in that drop-down list box here on our channel dialog, and then make sure the correct one is selected through the use of this selected folder ID. Okay. Notice also that I have a public property that allows us to pass in an instance of the data set that we're currently working with in the main form.cs. Now, why am I doing that? Because we don't want to create a whole second data set. We just want to use a reference to the existing data set that we have in the main form. Since this is a dialog, we're not going to be stepping on ourselves, so I'm not too worried about that. I just didn't want to create and have a whole other make it necessary to go and do another round trip to the database to retrieve all the rows out again and store those in memory again. It wouldn't make sense. Let's just pass in the one that we already have. We'll work with that. When we're done, we'll shut it down. We won't worry about it. Okay? Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so in the load event, similar to what it looked like in the folder dialog, setting the binding source, some of that information. If the channel ID is greater than 0, then that means we're in edit mode. If not, then we're in adding mode. Okay. So we set some of the information about the channel binding source as well. This will bind all of these fields, including the drop-down list box with all the folders, based on what we retrieve from the folder binding source and the channel binding source, respectively. Okay. Let's go back through here. When the user clicks OK, then we basically will either add or update. Again, we're using that scheme where if the channel ID is 0, that means we're in add mode. If the channel ID is greater than 0, that means we're editing an existing channel. So in the case of adding, we'll create a new channel row called channel. We'll populate its folder ID, title, URL, and last updated based on the selections that were made by the user, and then call the add channel row, passing in that new channel row. Here, we find the channel that we want to work with by using this find by channel ID, passing in the channel ID field. We're going to begin our edit and end our edit, and between the two, we'll change the folder ID, title, URL, and last updated to the values that were input by the user. Okay. Now notice, nowhere here did I call the update method. I could have done that, but I chose to leave that back out to the main form. So let's go to the main form, and let's click on the add channel, go to definition. Okay, here we go. So we create an instance of the channel dialog. We start setting its properties. We set the data source equal to our instance of that data set. We set the channel ID and the folder ID. Then we call our show dialog method, and we grab back the result. Based on whether the user clicked OK or cancel, we either call the update method or we don't. And then once we have updated the database, then we call query channels. What does query channels do? I don't know if we've talked about this yet, but query channels is that method which begins the process of refreshing the RSS feed by calling process newsfeed. I guess we did talk about that at the very beginning of this video, which was probably about an hour ago at this point. Okay, so the easiest way to really, for you to understand this, if you haven't already done so, please download the code for snapshot number 8, set some breakpoints, and start using the application and then stepping through code using the F11 key on your keyboard. And it's going to be a great education for you to see how the application performs now that we've added quite a bit of code in there. Okay, so we've got a fairly well-functioning application at this point. It's not 100% done. We'll reserve some more of those cleanup steps for our next snapshot. And we'll also, in the next video, talk about how to deploy this application on other users' computers.